Okay, hello everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining us today. My name is Jason Larson and I'm the head of content here at the International Institute for Analytics. I'm your host for today's session and welcome to today's webinar, the Federated Analytics Operating Model, Optimal Ways to Organize Analytics. All right, so in case you're new to the International Institute for Analytics, or IIA as we typically call ourselves, we are an independent, strategic, outcome-focused data and analytics advisory firm. We're practitioners working with practitioners. Analytics is all we do, and we do it with a relentless focus on measurable impact. Visit our homepage for more information about who we are and how we support data and analytics leaders in making the difficult and necessary transition to advanced analytics and AI. Before we dive into the presentation, let's go over a few housekeeping items. First, we encourage you to submit questions or comments via the chat window or the Q&A feature on the Zoom platform, and we'll make sure to save time at the end of the session to address as many questions as possible. Really the dialogue and questions that you bring to the table adds a lot of value to these sessions. So don't be shy, converse as a group in the comments, share resources, send us your questions. That level of engagement gives us all more to take away from the session. A recorded version of this webinar and the slides will be available and emailed out after the presentation. Okay, so without further ado, we are delighted to welcome Marc Demarest as our featured speaker today. Marc is an IIA expert and principal at Numinal, a consulting firm specializing in intellectual capital development. Marc has been hailed as the father of data marting, and if you joined us for Ryan Seuss's webinar last month on data fluency, he praised Marc's innovative thinking around data and information flows going back many years. That's all to say he's seen just about every permutation of data and analytics operations from the onset of enterprise scale analytics, and he has advised many traditional enterprises on their operating models, in particular helping DNA orgs transition to or rethink federated analytics. Today, Marc is going to walk through why centralized and distributed analytics operating models often fail to scale, how data and analytics organizations get stuck in what we call the oscillation trap between these two models, and a starting blueprint for transitioning to or resetting a federated analytics operating model. How best to organize your analytics team is a top challenge that IIA has advised our clients on for years. It's a topic near and dear to us, and we think the implications of a well-planned, well-structured, business-aligned analytics team are profound as it relates to the success, or in other words, business value and sustainability of that team. To put a finer point on it, we believe that federated analytics is the most appropriate end state for mature or maturing analytics organizations operating at enterprise scale. Successful federated analytics requires real structure, not just intent. And perhaps most importantly, federation is not a technical design. It is a human system, and human beings are hard. What I appreciate most about Marc's thoughts on organizing analytics is his attention to the human details and the influence of a company's unique history, culture, and politics on the analytics operating model. So Marc has been an expert in our network for a long time. He knows our clients and their challenges well. He's advised many leaders at IIA. He's been a key contributor to our thought leadership over the years. For IIA research and advisory network clients on the line, leverage your access to our expert network to solve your unique problems around how analytics is organized and operating at your company. Perhaps you've already had one-on-ones with Marc, and that's great. Use the network to get different practitioner perspectives, develop a plan, and take action. Don't hesitate to contact the IIA team to set up your next one-on-one expert exchange. If you're new to IIA and you lead a data and analytics team or have strategic responsibilities within that team, Marc has generously offered a free 30-minute consultation to talk through your specific organizing and operating challenges within the context of your company. Scan the QR code on the screen to set up that call today. I promise you'll walk away with fresh insights. So with that said, if you're joining us today, we're assuming you're interested in changing or refining how you operate as a data and analytics team. To help you in your efforts, we created a new comprehensive executive guide that lays out key considerations, transition strategies, and common pitfalls when adopting a federated analytics model. Follow the link in chat to download the ebook. As an attendee, you get first dibs at this resource. We hope you find it useful. You could almost think of the ebook as a foundational layer of sorts for the kinds of specific action-oriented conversations that our clients have with experts on this subject. All right, enough for me. Let's turn it over to Marc and let him dive into federated analytics. All right, Marc, I'll let you take it from here, sir.
Thank you, Jason. Welcome, everybody. I'm hopeful that you can all see my screen. I guess I should begin by picking up Jason's observation that I'm old and have seen a lot of analytics operating models and our attempt to discover optimal ways for organizing analytics as it becomes central to most organizations. And I think if I had to summarize my time in this industry, which dates back further than anybody, including I, would like to admit, I think when you look at analytics programs that are delivering business value episodically but not consistently, the core problems almost always net out to one or both of two things. The first is that analytics programs and projects are not being funded or measured properly in the organization. And the second is that the analytics operating model within the organization isn't tuned for the specific organization's culture, history, their needs, or their ways of working. I hope in the not too distant future, we'll have an opportunity to talk about problem number one, because it's a super knotty one. But today we're going to talk about problem number two. What does the optimal analytics operating model for organizations look like? Now, you've all seen diagrams like this notion that there's a continuum of design choices from more centralized to more decentralized. And you can easily get the impression from these sorts of diagrams that you're shopping for clothes, that this is a rack and you can pick a shirt or a suit or a dress off the rack somewhere between highly centralized and highly decentralized, and you can put it on and it's going to look great on you. But the truth is a lot more nuanced. There are optimal designs in this model, as Jason indicated, and as I'll suggest to you. What history tells us is that federated analytics operating models do tend to be where most high performance analytics organizations land. The question is, how do they get there? But I don't think this is a off the rack problem. I think this is highly tailored to your particular organization, its history, its ways of working, and to be honest, the history of the politics of analytics in your organization. Most
Marc, sorry to interrupt, but we cannot see your screen if you're showing your slides yet.
Okay, well, let's see if we can fix that.
My apologies for interrupting the flow.
No, no worries.
There we go.
Any better?
Yep, there we go.
So most organizations begin with a centralized model, a single core analytics group that effectively attempts to provide service to all of the demand side segments that more or less naturally occur in every organization of any scale. And the centralized option is the default option in a lot of cases because analytics is spun out of the IT organization, out of a reporting group, a reporting bureau, some team that is focused on meeting early nascent demand for data and analytics. And the model that central analytics team follows for meeting this distributed need is a pretty conventional model. You give me requirements, I scope, size, and cost those requirements. I deliver some kind of project, whether that's a standing analytical application or an ad hoc report with a short time cycle. There's a loop here, requirements to delivery. Everybody who's run this model for any length of time knows as demand grows, which is the primary metric for success of an analytics program, as your demand grows, the response time of the central team slows. Initially, you try to solve that problem by adding more resources, but resources have costs associated with them, and eventually you run up against the cost envelope for the centralized team. You simply can't add more resources. And at that point in time, you'll see a lot of centralized teams start to pay a lot of attention to intake and prioritization models. How are we taking in these projects? How are we evaluating, prioritizing them, costing them? How can we reduce that cycle time? But the net effect is always the same. Some groups are kept waiting too long. The wait extends beyond the decision-making cycle that local team is trying to service. And some groups get nothing because they are continually deprioritized by these increasingly elaborate intake and prioritization models. And what happens in the wake of that is that demand side teams start to build their own capability. They turn to outside vendors to meet their needs. They do some combination of both, not because they are dissatisfied with the output of the centralized team when they get it, but because the process is broken. It simply can't keep pace with the demand side cycles in each of these segments. So you see organizations move from this centralized model because of this throttling of demand to a distributed model. And in the distributed model, which to be honest, some organizations will actually begin with, you have a local analytics team, often funded by the business unit within which they operate, meeting local needs, either because that's where analytics naturally percolates up first in the organization. It shows up in marketing, it shows up in sales, it shows up in manufacturing, or because the centralized team has failed to align with the decision cycles and the range of needs in that business unit. And the great advantage, the core advantage of local analytics teams is that they meet local needs with local expertise at local speed. That is a profound value proposition. But when you look at analytics organizationally, what you discover almost immediately, excuse me, is that analytics capability is very unevenly distributed within these organizations. You have highly autonomous business and functional units who are essentially able to meet their local needs with little or no support from any centralized team. You have, what I consider to be well-behaved business units that are coordinating with what is now a very small centralized team to get things done. And you have business and functional units who, as in the past, continue to be underserved or unserved. And there's another pernicious problem in this model, which is each of those autonomous units is making quasi-independent or independent choices about technology, tooling, data organization, methods and practices. Not only is the DNA organization fragmenting, but the entire analytics infrastructure is fragmenting. There's a lot of duplication, there's a lot of overlap, costs rise, and at the same time, burden on pretty fragile shared systems that provide the source for a lot of these data, the data sets, starts to overwhelm those systems. Because instead of extracting once a day from a particular system, we're extracting 6, 7, 8 times a day in some cases, because each autonomous team is doing its own data extraction and data engineering work. In the distributed model, in the end, you have demand running very fast, which is good, running wild, which is frightening, particularly for corporate functions, the chief legal officer, the risk team, the finance organization. Costs are going up, and in some unpleasant cases that I've seen, and I suspect some of you have seen as well, the distributed model causes the organization to run afoul of external regulation. We are reporting incorrect information to an outside entity. So you end up in this interesting situation that we refer to, as Jason said, as the oscillation trap. As centralized models increase the impedance, the inertia that is inherent in the centralized model, you have these distributed analytics teams emerging. They're emerging out of necessity, and eventually a senior leader looks around the organization and says, what are we doing with this centralized team? It looks like a source of cost rather than a source of value. And they formalize the distributed model, and they distribute the resources and the technological capabilities out into the organization. Costs start to climb, the variation multiplies more and more. We come to understand the practical value of one version of the truth because now we have 6 or 7 versions of the truth, and risk rises. And a senior leader again calls the question, when are we going to bring this highly distributed organization back under control? And so all the resources are centralized, and we remodel the finances. And the second time around, there's somebody in the audience who looks a lot like me, saying, boy, finally we're back to where we used to be. This is the right way to do things. And then we start to repeat the cycle. Numinal has clients who went through this oscillation 6 or 7 times over the course of a decade or more before they broke through the oscillator trap. It is a pernicious and, in our view, a common problem. Centralized, decentralized, centralized, decentralized. And when you think about the lifespan of many senior positions in the typical DNA organization, you can see why the oscillator can be so pernicious, because we are changing out leaders often at a fairly rapid pace. So in my view, the federated analytics operating model, which emphasizes both a centralized team and distributed teams with very clear definitions around roles, responsibilities, expectations, very clear workflows, very clear protocols, is the way to break out of the oscillation trap. In my view, there should be a central team. It should always own the shared platform that all analytics in the organization is done on top of. It is responsible for governance. In many cases, it is the best and perhaps the only source of talent for truly advanced analytics, prescriptive, generative, those things that require not only access to, relatively speaking, immense amounts of processing resources, but also highly sophisticated data science skills. But you also have very strong local teams, and the local teams are responsible for delivering actionable value at business speed. They are often funded by the organization that they are embedded in, which means that those organizations locally can grow as fast as they are delivering value to that part of the business. And they have, in many cases, a lot of autonomy, particularly over final form data and information products. What things actually get delivered to that particular demand side constituency. And to keep this kind of constellation functional, you need to have a single shared community of practice. You need to be sharing best practices, sharing techniques, insights amongst these groups. And that curation of that single community is also a responsibility of the central analytics team. So what you get in a federated model is you get distributed activity on a centralized platform with common methods and centralized governance. That's the sort of design objective of a federated model. The real objective of a federated model can be very simply stated. We want to have local decision cycles driving everything. It all comes down to what the cycle time, the decision cycle time, looks like at the edge of the organization for a particular local team serving particular local needs. Some of our older ideas, the idea, for example, that it's really important to deliver one version of the truth, we port that directly over, but it's qualified. We want to deliver one version of the truth where that is actually required, and we want to enable variation where that is required. So instead of thinking about the world as a set of key metrics that are calculated once and stored in a data warehouse and delivered to people via dashboards, we're thinking about a world in which data is staged in various states on the way to being final form, and where metrics can and often are variable. And we keep track of all of that and we govern all of it, but one version of the truth is in most healthy federated analytics operating models somewhat more restricted than it was, say, in the heyday of data warehousing. We have to ensure that legal, regulatory, and security infosec controls are addressed and are effective by design. That's a central function. We need to empower local teams to act and build capability over time. So underserved, unserved segments with very little local analytics talent have to be shepherded and curated and built up by a centralized team so that they can act autonomously. We obviously want to reduce cycle times. We want to maintain shared standards, full transparency, who's doing what, with what, how, and when across the entire enterprise. And ultimately, we want to shift the focus of these local teams from pulling data to generating insights, from the classic 80-20 problem to 20-80. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with this challenge. The shorter the decision cycle, the more time is spent identifying, collecting, integrating, and proofing data. In many cases, that's all we have time for. There's very little analysis and no time at all for communication beyond sending an email with a set of tabular data in it saying, here's the answer to your question. It's not particularly effective. It doesn't generate insights. In a lot of cases, the communication is delivered to people whose attention span is shorter than it ever has been, who are crying out not for the data, but to be told what to do, and in some cases to be told how to do it. So we need to break this 80-20 problem. We need it to become a 20-80 problem. So 20% of the time for any local team is spent doing collection, integration, and proofing. There's plenty of time for analysis and plenty of time for communication. That is really the way to measure your success at implementing a federated analytics model. Do local teams report that their analysis time is increasing and their data collection, integration, and proofing time is decreasing? Are they on the way to 2080? There was a time in this industry where we believed that the operating model for an analytics organization basically could be summarized in an org chart and really was not in any way pervasive or interconnected with other parts of the organization, but I think we really know better now. Successful federated analytics operating models always require the active participation of the finance organization. They always have to address the flows of work, the transfer of work, and the integration of teams in data-related activities, analytics-related activities, and decision-making and action-taking activities. And they always have things to say about the analytics infrastructure, which should be common across the entire organization, the governance and adjudication process, which includes security and privacy, but is a superset of that. And as I said earlier, the way in which the data and analytics community is actively curated and developed by the centralized team. One of the most important parts of this, and it's one that almost never gets talked about without provocation, is adjudication. How does this system work when someone doesn't follow the rules? People are hard, as Jason said earlier. People don't follow the rules. And they don't follow the rules for a lot of good reasons, including My boss has to have this information in front of her by tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. And I can't do that following the standard process. So I'm going to violate it because I know what's most important, and that's delivering this to my boss by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Having a system in which human beings are the driver and in which you know that rules will be broken, but yet having no adjudication mechanism is really setting yourself up to fail. So the model is pervasive. It covers a lot of ground, and it has to cover a lot of ground in order to be successful. This isn't about org charts, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. You can't pick an operating model off the rack and expect it to work. It's all about details. But there is a place to start. So if you're thinking about this, and you're staring at that white sheet of paper and you're saying, geez, I'm not even sure where to begin, try beginning here. If you have a CIO or a CDO or both, the part of the organization that they're responsible for in a federated analytics operating model often includes all source system extraction and sometimes all external data ingestion, the operation of the common analytics platform, and enterprise data quality and foundational data governance. That's a set of responsibilities that that particular part of the organization should have historic familiarity with and high levels of competence in. The central analytics team often is responsible for all of the shared data pipelines and all of the conformed data products and the prior states of those data products. It's often responsible for all of the standards and governance frameworks around analytical tooling, data products, what can and cannot be done to those products, by whom, when, and under what circumstances. And it's also, as I said earlier, often responsible for true advanced analytics, prescriptive analytics, generative analytics, analytics that requires significant technology investment and access to deep expertise. And then distributed teams are usually the source of domain expertise. I know what the semantics of this particular data product are better than anybody in the organization. They are responsible for generating local actionable insights. Often, they are responsible for final form analytical products with details and final form data products. So the notion that I grew up with, which is that all data products, as we now call them, are produced once and they're stored in a central location, and others are invited to consume them. We knew that was a fiction when we invented the idea. We knew that those data products were extracted and transformed and aggregated and integrated with other things locally, but it was useful to maintain that fiction. Now we embrace the notion that the ultimate data product is likely going to be produced by a local team, and it should be produced within guardrails that are established by the central team. And in many cases, that final form information product produced in marketing has to be re-ingested into the common platform in a sort of MVP-ish fashion, and then hardened and made more broadly available. So as I said, federated models are never one size fits all. Every model is going to be organization specific. They're negotiated structures and not static blueprints. So this is an exercise in diplomacy, in working with teams that are naturally in tension with one another to establish treaty lines. Who is going to do what to whom, under what circumstances, when something goes wrong, who's responsible, when the protocol is violated, how is it adjudicated, and a final decision reached. Successful models, and I've seen literally dozens of them, are always rule bound, but they're flexible. You'll see successful federated models with defined workflows, defined standard operating procedures, as I said, dispute mechanisms, and those tend to be captured in role responsibility and expectation documents or RACI diagrams, whatever fits your culture. However your company thinks about memorializing decision rights, the federated model should incorporate that method of memorializing those decision rights. It's going to be iterative. You're going to have version 1 of the federated model, and it's going to be superseded in time by version 2 and by version 3, and that's healthy, and you should plan for it. Resources and funding will shift by design. Failed organization federated models will either collapse into centralization or they'll just fragment. But if you're iterating in a healthy way, you'll be moving the organization forward with each iteration, solving problems that occurred in the prior iteration, in some cases introducing new problems that will have to be solved in the next. That's healthy and normal. Change is constant, has to be managed. And this is particularly the case when you are building federation in an organization that has been in the oscillator and has DNA employees who were in the centralized version and liked it, and who were in the decentralized version and liked it. In the absence of good structure, good protocols, good rules, those folks in times of crisis and when the model is not clear will default to the way they used to do it, unless you plan to counter that. When you're allocating resources, it's important to think about that as being separate from the federated operating model per se. You could allocate resources in a federated model by embedding centralized team members in the business. And by embedding, I mean fully embedded. They live, eat, sleep, and breathe the local team's environment. Could be paid for 100% by the central organization and then allocated as pods. I've seen it work. It can work. You can have locally owned teams, and those are folks that are hired, onboarded, trained, developed, and paid for by the organization in which they sit, and have centralized oversight, community curation. That also works. And there's lots of temporary exchange that goes on in a healthy federated model, where subject matter experts that are in the business get seconded into the centralized organization when new data products are being built before going back out to their local team. Typically, centralized team members, particularly those who are responsible for curation, participate in the recruitment and hiring and onboarding process for local team members. And in the most sophisticated model I've ever seen, the centralized team has actually set up a resource auctioning system in which two local analytics teams can actually bid for the services of centralized resources when those resources are scarce and high value. So you got a lot of options with resource allocation once you've adopted the federated model. As I said earlier, it's not primarily about org charts. It's about how resources are distributed and who pays for them. When organizations embark on the journey to federated analytics operating models, when you see misses, they will often look like this. The focus is on structure instead of on the flow of work. And that will look like I created org charts and maybe I moved people around, but nothing else changed. And it often looked like there are no documented protocols. We don't have RRE, we don't have RACI diagrams. We haven't actually trained people on what it means to be in the central team or the distributed team. We don't have any mechanism for handling exceptions or adjudicating disputes. There'll be lack of operational clarity, no adjudication methods, no metrics to measure the success of the model or how effectively the model's being adopted in different parts of the organization. And the funding model from the prior incarnation will remain in place. And you'll know that's true because although you have the best intention of producing a single analytics platform with a single set of data products that are in various stages of completion and are fanning out into the organization as they become more and more complete, what you're actually producing continues to be stovepiped data products serving stovepiped analytic needs for a single part of the organization. And that stovepiping will be pretty clear indication that when you move to a federated model, you didn't actually change the way anybody paid for anything. And there are a lot of unpleasant downstream consequences. You get a lot of unfunded mandate problem. You must do this, but I'm not going to help you pay for it. It's not clear who's accountable. We have a lot of confusion and non-compliance with governance. So governance continues to struggle to actually get people's behavior inside the guardrails it's established. End runs, workarounds, breakdowns in coordination become the norm. It looks very chaotic, not well organized and coordinated. And reversion occurs. You revert to centralized model, you fragment into a pretty chaotic distributed model, and then that oscillation trap returns. And that's someplace nobody wants to be after you've embarked on what is, when all is said and done, a pretty complex organizational change management program. Some warning signs for those of you who may be in this process or contemplating this process. More than once, I've seen centralized teams embrace federation as a way of taking all of those smart and highly competent local analytics teams and bringing them under centralized control. It's just air cover for an attempt at re-centralization. That will, without doubt, not be successful. One of the ways you know that that's happening is the most highly autonomous, most highly affected local analytics teams are the first target when you're doing your restructuring for federated analytics. They should be the last target, but they're the first. Tooling, methods, and practices get prioritized over data road mapping and the acceleration of the delivery of data products. This isn't really about technology and tooling. The way we get from 80-20 to 2080 is by first and foremost making the information value chain that produces data products from raw source data or raw external data as efficient, planful, and expected as possible. Success is not being measured by the two hallmarks of a good federated analytics model: local decisions at local speed and from 80-20 to 2080. A more subtle but very important warning sign is that it's not possible to fund infrastructure projects. We need to bring in a new data engineering pipeline oriented near real-time tools. We actually can't do that unless we can find a project that drags that in with it. That's a clear sign that we haven't dealt with the funding model challenges associated with federated analytics. And then last but not least, and easy to spot and likely to trigger the oscillator, is that local analytics teams are actually going to outside vendors to get their needs met. That's going to be noticed. It's going to be noticed by business leadership, and someone's going to ask the question, why is it this way? And do we need to reorganize? So as a way of closing out and providing a decent amount of time for questions and answers, I'll just say in closing that every time I interact with a client in this space, I find a client that is somewhere in the oscillation trap. They are highly distributed and it's not working well. They are highly centralized and things are slowing to a crawl. And the interest in getting out of this trap is as high and as broad-based as I have seen it ever. It shows up in every vertical market with which I'm conversant, and it shows up increasingly across the size range from very large organizations down into the small to medium-sized enterprise. DNA organizations that are running lean are looking for a lean answer to these systemic changes. And there is no real lean answer. You cannot pick it off a rack, but there are practical short cycle actions that any team can take within a single year, a single operating cycle of their employer, to design and implement the first generation of their federated analytics operating model that's really intended to work for that organization in the state that it's in at that time with the analytical needs that it has at that time. When I look either through the IIA lens or directly as a principal in Numinal at organizations that are exhibiting mature analytics behavior, what the IIA score would rate at kind of a 3.2 or 3.3 or higher in their scale, all of those organizations are federated. The sad part about that is too many of them are federated after spending a lot of time in the oscillator between centralized and decentralized organizations. So that's my pitch. Thank you very much for your attention. Jason, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Mark. That was excellent. We've got a lot of really good questions here. So let's get started. And these two are a bit related. So if your organization is in the early stages of analytics, concerning analytics, the team is not fully established. Is it better to begin centralized or decentralized at the beginning of the game?
If you have a choice at the beginning of the game, you have a small team and there's no obvious underserved demand side segment. What do I mean by that? Marketing is not screaming for way better data and analytics capability than it has now. If those two things are true, small team, no obviously underserved segment, then start centralized. But when you do that, you really have to make sure that you instill into that centralized team the notion that it is simply the hub in the wheel, and that there are going to be spokes and there are going to be other teams, and it's not too early to start drawing your treaty lines around what that centralized team will do steady state and what they have to do in the short term, because they are the genetic seed that will bring forth in the fullness of time this federated model. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. So, this is a related question that came in is, are there any examples when the federated model shouldn't be used? So like when you may want some separation of duty between the centralized part of the model, for example, building the marketing and risk analytic capabilities.
Yeah, I think that I have a hard time coming up with any specific case in which external pressures, regulatory, legal, litigation risk pressures, might dictate a centralized organization, or work strongly against federation. I can imagine that there are things. I can imagine, for example, that single product companies who are making and moving hard goods in a legal environment that is highly litigious through a captive direct sales force might be centralized, largely because of the litigation risks that their product of choice exposes the organization to. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question. Am I?
Yeah. You're answering the question. I think that kind of gets our wheels turning a little bit. Um, so what tactics what tactics to use to get non-analytics leaders to see the problem
Oh,
with the oscillation cycle and then making fixed changes? How to make the burning platform for change? I love this question.
no, it's a super question, because it is a change management problem. You do want non-technical leadership, the business, as we like to say, not just aware of the change, but driving the change. So I think that's absolutely true. You have to work with each part of the business in entirely local terms. So the case for change gets made not by making a pitch to the senior leadership team, but by making a series of pitches to every member of the senior leadership team, whether they're staff or line, and always in local terms. So for the CFO, the history of being in the oscillation trap needs to be a history about the spending of money and the opportunity costs incurred by reorganization every 2 or 3 years. For the VP of marketing that has a very capable local analytics team and perhaps doesn't understand why a federated model would be valuable to him, you have to be able to tie it to what that local organization is not getting. It is very much a thoughtful sales and marketing activity. It's quite common when I do this work with clients to have a phase of the process in which you are merely gathering data about where the likely cultural, organizational, and political blockers are for a federated model. And that involves a lot of conversation with people, asking hard questions, hearing hard answers, followed by a second phase, which is entirely about socialization, about crafting the value proposition for each member of the senior leadership team, and then delivering that value proposition and hearing the objections, just like you would in any sales activity. So it takes time. It's not one PowerPoint presentation that you deliver once and everyone says, "Oh God, I see the light. Let's do it." It takes time to make the sale.
Yeah. Okay. So in moving from centralized to federated, we're kind of switching gears here a little bit. How do you determine which existing products stay with the central team versus distributing? What about resource splits? Any guidelines there?
Yeah, so I tried to give you like the starting blueprint that I use. My starting blueprint includes my belief that from a data product perspective, the centralized team is typically best resourced and most capable at going from raw extract through at least conformed data product. So for those of you who maybe are a little bit older like me, that's all the way to the load data for final form star schemas. But local teams are almost always going to be producing some final form data product. So you draw the line in there somewhere. You accept the reality of data prep tools like Alteryx. You accept that those tools make a moderately competent data person more competent and more dangerous, and you ask, what are the guidelines, what are the standard operating procedures that we need to put in place in order to make sure that that final form data product work in local teams is properly governed. So you have to have a hypothesis, draw that line somewhere, look at the resources you have centrally and locally, and then decide if that line makes sense. And you got to have those hypotheses going in to that data gathering process that I talked about earlier. You can't go in without one and expect the hypothesis to emerge from your conversations. So that starting blueprint I offered you is as good a place as any to start. You just have to avoid becoming enamored of it or wedded to it, and treat it as indeed it is, a starting hypothesis and nothing more. Was there a second part to that question that I missed, Jason?
There is not a second part to that question. I mean, there is a related question, and let me know if you kind of covered it here. So, can you explain more how you see data acquisition and data product deliverables working effectively, efficiently in a federated model? One challenge we have today is getting structured data ready for analysis or BI work for local teams to leverage in a timely manner.
Yeah, I think, as I said, my starting hypothesis is the local team has to have the capability of taking a properly staged, conformed data set and producing a final form data product, whether that final form is a star schema that is addressing particular ad hoc analytical needs for its local team, or it is a unique data set, which incorporates an external data source that no other demand side segment is interested in, but that particular segment is wildly interested in. That's my sense of where you start drawing that line.
Mm-hmm.
The important bit is less where you draw the line than it is how do you govern the distributed production of data products? How do you make sure that when provider analytics in a healthcare concern develops a unique data product to judge the effectiveness of provider delivery, how do you make sure that that data set is properly governed so that A, it can be used by other groups who may need it for other purposes, and B, when a regulator comes knocking, asking annoying questions about how you've made a particular set of decisions, you're able to say, we did it on the basis of this data set, and here it is.
What are some common adjudication consequences when someone doesn't follow the process?
Well, great. That's a superb question. In extreme cases, I have seen repeat offenders, routine violators of standard operating procedures be assigned elsewhere in the organization out of DNA. That person was communicating not simply their inability to follow the rules, but their unwillingness to follow the rules. And you have to be prepared to go that far if you expect to get compliance. In the usual case, what you find in an adjudication process is the protocol is violated. There's an escalation to the adjudication group, which is typically, a kind of steering committee like ad hoc group of folks, fairly senior in DNA and in the business. And the conclusion is that this particular protocol violation was correct given the circumstances, that it was an exception and it was tolerable, and that's the end of it. But just having that mechanism, me knowing as a data engineer in the manufacturing organization that if I don't follow the rules, it's highly likely that I'm going to have to explain myself, you'll get an extraordinarily higher level of compliance than you will if there is no adjudication mechanism at all. And if the folks in the central team who are ultimately responsible for the adjudication process are politically savvy, then there will, relatively early in the history of that adjudication process, be an event, the consequences for which are really unfortunate for the person who violated the protocol. And that will, again, have a remarkable effect, just that one incident, in improving the conformance. Because most people do not violate protocols out of malicious intent. Most of them violate protocols because there is a higher order override in that particular situation. But there are always, in any complex human system, a relatively small number of people who simply do not want to follow the rules. So you kind of have to deal with both cases. Does that answer the question?
It does. That does answer the question. So moving on here, can each business unit, so the demand side, have their own federated agreement, or should they be consistent? In other words, can you have a situation where you have multiple federation agreements?
Essentially, a good federated model will look like that. If you think of it as a series of bilateral treaties between the centralized team and a federated local organization, each of those treaties will look differently. There will be demand side segments that are unserved. They have analytical needs, they have no local capability, and in the old centralized model, they were deprioritized. They just flat out didn't get. Those kinds of groups will want a lot of service from the central team. The central team, if they're smart, is not going to simply turn into the reporting bureau for that local demand side segment and do everything for them, right? This is the teach them to fish rather than fish for them. So there's a development plan as part of that bilateral agreement. Whereas with the manufacturing organization, which is highly sophisticated, highly autonomous, and doesn't require anything more than properly staged data in the common platform, that's going to be an entirely different agreement. So that portfolio of demand side segments from completely underserved to highly autonomous is a fact of life. And so, yes, there will be different agreements, different service level agreements. There will not be different agreements in most cases about governance, tooling, use of the platform, adjudication. Those are common. It's simply the case that, to pick on adjudication again, it's highly unlikely that that unserved segment will ever, at least not in the foreseeable future, have an adjudication problem. And it's pretty likely that that highly competent, well-resourced local team over there in manufacturing is going to find itself in adjudication challenges from time to time. Again, that's healthy.
Okay. All right. So let's try to squeeze in one more here. This is a superb question. Might be difficult to answer in a minute. But how would you assess the financial impacts of going to federated versus other models?
So my going in hypothesis again is that if the organization is centralized and inertia has set in and they have tried all sorts of prioritization mechanisms and all sorts of intake processes and they can't escape the inertia of the centralized model. So they want to go to federation. They don't want to get trapped in the oscillator. They want to go to the end state as quickly as possible. In the short term, federated models are going to be in aggregate more expensive than that centralized model, but that expense is distributed. Marketing is carrying marketing analytics costs and sales is carrying sales analytics costs. But in aggregate, from the CFO's perspective, it's more expensive. It's an investment. If, on the other hand, the organization is today highly distributed and probably has a central team which is trying but failing to deliver reliably to a wide variety of more or less autonomous demand side segments with their own tooling, et cetera, federation is going to be cheaper than a distributed model. So that's my snappy answer to a very complicated question.
Great. Okay. All right, everybody. Excellent questions and comments. Thank you all for the participation and your engagement. Marc, thank you for your insights. I know everybody on the line was very appreciative. And we will be sharing the recording of this webinar in an upcoming email, and it will also be available on our website along with the slides. And please take 1 minute to give feedback on this session. It really helps us develop timely and relevant content for the community. And also, again, if you're new to IIA, don't hesitate to book a free 30-minute consultation with Marc to talk through your challenges related to this topic. Stay tuned on our email and social channels for tools and resources and other content to help you build a successful federated analytics operating model. And thanks again, everybody. Onward and upward. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks,
all.
everyone.